Welcome, freedom fighters. Let me start with something uncomfortable. A quiet tsunami of change is fast heading our way, and the next big shock won't feel like a shock at all. There won't be alarms, there won't be breaking news, there won't be a moment where someone says, right, this is it. It'll be quieter than that, like a system update, like a role being reviewed, like a polite email that says your position has been impacted. Because AI isn't coming for jobs, it's coming for certainty. And when certainty goes, everything that depends on it starts to wobble. Your borrowing power, your buffers, your ability to hold property when things get messy. And here's the trap. Most investors won't lose money because they made a bad call. They'll lose it because they stayed confident for just a bit too long. They'll still be arguing about hotspots, medians, and whether prices or rates are up or down, while the real risk moves quietly underneath their feet. It's like rearranging the deck chairs while the ship's GPS is pointing somewhere new. And to be clear, this episode isn't about doom. It's awareness. Because Australia is heading into a decade where work changes faster, income gets less predictable, and the gap widens between people who adapt and people who just keep doing what used to work. And the ones who get caught out won't be reckless. They'll be smart, they'll be busy, they'll be nodding along to podcasts that make them feel informed, while missing the one big thing that actually matters. So if you want a future-proof filter that tells you where demand's likely to grow, where it's likely to leak, and what true affordability actually means, make sure you listen to the end. And if you know someone who's buying property right now, or will do this year based on vibes and headlines, do them a big favour. Share this episode. All right, let's get into it.
Welcome to Get Invested on the Property Hub podcast channel, the leading weekly show for Australians who want to learn how to unlock their full self, health and wealth potential. I'm your host, Bushy Martin, and each week I go deep with the best investors, experts, leaders and founders to find out what it takes to break free from the grind, discover freedom and to live by design. Subscribe now and join me and get invested in the life that you really want. Let's get started.
Hi, freedom fighters. I've been promising you for some time that I'd share my research and views on the long-term future of work and property, because if you really want to achieve sustainable success, the long-term future is what really matters. Not the next hotspot, not the latest headline, not what's going to boom this year. I mean the stuff that actually matters over the next 10 to 15 years, so you can lift your sights above the noise of the podcast cycle and give yourself the best chance of joining the 5% investors who actually build sustainable success and fierce independence, instead of the 95% who stay busy but never quite get there. So today, we're finally doing it. But before we talk property, I need to say something important right up front. Sadly, a lot of property content these days isn't education, it's clickbait entertainment, because social media and related algorithms now only reward fear, greed, outrage, and hot takes. And I don't know about you, but I'm sick to death of seeing podcasts and YouTubes with headings like brutal warning now, the best areas to invest this year, property prices about to crash, or property set to boom. And they all have animated photos of the hosts who look like they've just had a stroke or suffered an electric shock. It does my head in the way they all say almost anything to grab your attention. So in my humble opinion, many property influencers and high-profile buyers agents aren't chasing the truth, they're chasing clicks. And clicks don't pay your mortgage. They just build their business, often at your expense. But that's definitely not what I'm here to do, here on Get Invested and here on the Property Hub. I'm not here to build a business off your anxiety by filling you with FOMO based on flashy graphics and TV studio production. I'm here to be your go-to trusted source of truth and insight in a world of confusing short-term property noise, because I've got no vested interest in you buying anything. These days, I do this podcast purely for fun and for the fulfillment of giving freely. So you can avoid the many mistakes I made, and I can teach you how to invest in property properly, so you can build your version of real freedom. That's why total independent objectivity matters so much to me, and why I share insights with you that most others don't or won't. Now, before I start helping you to lift your sights and begin reading property's future weather systems and winds of change, I want you to picture something, because property isn't a spreadsheet. Property is a story, a future-focused story. And right now, Australia's waking and walking towards some major forks in the road. And most of us don't even realise it, because we're a bit like frogs in a slowly boiling pot. The water's heating up, but it's happening so gradually that we don't feel what's really changing, or what's coming. And what's coming is a tsunami of change. So, before we go any further, let me challenge you with a few questions to get you in the right frame. If AI can do 50% of your job by Tuesday, what happens to your salary by Christmas? If your role feels safe today, is it still safe after the next AI update? If your job gets augmented, are you the one holding the tool or the one getting replaced by it? If your household income drops for 2 years, can you still hold your property? Or do you become a forced seller right when everyone else is panicking too? If insurance triples in your postcode, or you can no longer insure your property, do you still own an investment or just a very expensive property? If your local area relies on one industry, one employer, or one big shopping centre, what happens when that industry gets automated, outsourced, or shut down? And if your kids can't get an entry-level job because the ladder has lost its bottom rungs, what happens to household formation and the next wave of housing demand? And if the world keeps getting messier, with wars, trade bans, tariffs, populist tantrums, and supply chains seizing up like a gearbox with no oil, do jobs, incomes, interest rates, and property really behave the same way they have over the last few decades? And here's the big question that most don't realise is the big one. When you buy a property today, who are you actually buying it for in 10 to 15 years' time? Because it's not your tenant this year, not the bank, not your mate at the barbie who says, bro, this area is the next big thing. If you're smart, you're buying it for a future owner-occupier, the emotional buyer, the one who falls in love and then overpays. Because it's scarce, because it's special, because it's lifestyle. So when you buy a property today, you're not selling to the market. You're selling to a fellow Aussie, with a family, with a job, with emotions, and with a budget. Now, let me tell you a story about our future, where the old movie Sliding Doors meets a tale of two Australias. Same year, same country, same couple, but two very different decisions and two very different outcomes. And you could almost hear the train sliding doors closing. So let's start with door one. Imagine it's February 2040, and Queensland's sweating. Not the normal kind of sweaty, the kind where the air feels heavy and angry. You know, that smell right before a storm hits, that metallic, humid punch in the nose. Now, imagine that on repeat. The news tickers on a loop, flood warnings, evac centres, roads cut, again. Up north the river rises, not politely, not slowly, it comes up like a thief. People stacking sandbags at midnight with phone torches in their mouths and kids' school uniforms stuffed into garbage bags. Meanwhile, down south in Victoria, the state is on fire again, like every year now. And the hardest part? It's not the flood or the fire itself, it's the letter that arrives afterwards. Your insurance premium has doubled, or worse, we're no longer prepared to insure you. No insurance, no bank comfort, no buyer confidence, and you read it 3 times because your brain refuses to accept it. Now layer on what AI has done. The middle class didn't disappear, it got carved out. A big chunk of white-collar work didn't get augmented, it got optimised. That's the polite word, optimised, which is just code for replaced. Junior roles disappeared first, then middle management got flattened, then whole departments became a subscription. You don't get redundancy anymore, you get an email, a log-on that stops working, a calendar that goes blank. And suddenly, your suburbs feels different. More for lease signs, more quiet driveways, fewer coffees sold, fewer kids' parties, more late-night arguments about what gets cancelled next. And the world hasn't helped. Trades become spiky, supply chains wobble, energy prices jump every time another global tantrum kicks off. Politics gets angrier, because when people feel squeezed, they vote with their gut. So governments do what governments do. They reach for blunt tools, like rent caps, land taxes, new levies with nice names that sound fair on TV and hit like a hammer in real life. And property? This is where it gets brutal. Australia becomes a two-track property landscape with a handbrake on. The wrong pockets don't just underperform, they become fragile. Commodity estates, endless comparables, weak incomes, long commutes, climate headaches, insurance pain. They don't just crash overnight, they just stop inspiring anyone, and quietly, they die on the vine. Buyers negotiate harder, lenders tighten, tenants churn, holding costs nibble you to death, and you feel it, not in the data, but in your stomach, because you don't sleep like you used to. And that's door one, our worst case future. Now let's jump to the other end of the spectrum and consider our best case by taking sliding door two. So walk back with me to today. Same country, same couple, same deposit. But this time, Australia makes very different choices, and AI gets used differently, not as a guillotine, but as a jetpack. Productivity actually lifts, not just profits. We don't just lose jobs, we redesign them. AI becomes part of our power belt. And not the boss with the axe. So new energy actually gets built, not just promised by pollus. Solar, storage, transmission, firming, the boring, expensive infrastructure stuff that makes everything else possible. And suddenly, some regional hubs don't just survive, they level up. You can feel it when you drive in. New cafes that aren't empty, schools with wait lists, a hospital wing that's being built, trades being booked out for months. Because the town's upgrading itself. In housing, we still have a shortage, but construction gets smarter. Prefab, better materials, better design, better processes. Not magic, but improvement. And because Aussies can work more flexibly, they start choosing more remote lifestyle locations without surrendering income. So property becomes more precise. Not one big boom, more like a string of bonfires. The right pockets compound quietly, scarce, walkable, connected, livable, resilient. And the best times, the ones owner-occupiers love, values increase and still get paid overs for. Because no matter how much tech you build, we can't manufacture a waterfront, a heritage street, a perfect school catchment, a great climate pocket, or a genuinely scarce lifestyle location. Scarcity is still finite. And the emotional buyer is still emotional. So door two isn't perfect, but it's hopeful, it's buildy, and it's optimistic with a hard hat on. The point? I'm not here to tell you which door Australia's going to walk through. I'm here to help you build a strategy, one that survives door one and thrives through door two. Because if you keep buying property like it's 1998, you'll get 1998 outcomes. And future decades will definitely not look like 1998. So today I'm going to give you a filter, not a forecast. You'll know what to buy, what to avoid, and how to protect the income that pays your holding costs. So now, let's get invested properly. And let's simplify things, because most people buy property like they're buying a lottery ticket. They want a quick win, a hotspot, a headline, but that's not investing, that's gambling with stamp duty. So before you buy anything, answer this critical question. Who am I going to sell this to in 10 to 15 years' time? Because growth isn't linear. Precincts don't grow in straight lines. They grow in repeating and variable S-curves, where an area's property values are slow and sideways for between 5 to 8 years. Then in sharp rising momentum for 1 to 3 years, when the three I's of new infrastructure, industry and rising incomes kick in. Before it then corrects and softens for 1 to 2 years, and then repeats and starts again going sideways for another 5 to 8 years, in a sort of a peak and plateau step fashion. And that total S-curve progression generally takes somewhere between 8 to 15 years. And each S-curve normally varies in time frame from one local S-curve to the next, with every area and precinct going through its own S-curve at a different stage to every other area. Note that I'm talking about an area and precinct, which is far smaller than a suburb or state, which is why I don't worry about medium state and suburb data, because they make good media stories, but they don't actually matter. Which is why buying property based on a 1-year forecast is like judging a marathon runner after the first lap. And here's the bit that changes everything. If you can afford to hold a property for 15 years, you give yourself the best chance to ride an entire local S-curve to reap the long-term growth rewards, without worrying about timing the so-called market, without panicking during the messy middle. That's why I say property's a 15-year plus decision, not a 1-year punt. And the reason that most investors fall off the horse isn't suburb choice, it's cash flow, affordability, holding power. We'll build that income oxygen safety net in a short amount of time. And if you're time poor lifestyle now investors who don't want a second job when you buy a property, this matters more than ever, because your properties are doing the heavy lifting while you're busy living. So they need to be affordable to hold, resilient through cycles, and positioned for long-term demand. Now, before we go any further, we need to pause, because not all of you listening should be doing the same thing. And this is where most property advice goes wrong. It assumes everyone's at the same stage, but we're not. So here's the question that decides everything. Not suburb, not strategy, not yield, but this one. Are you still building, or are you getting ready to live? This is where your freedom numbers come in. These include your lifestyle income number, your required nest egg number, your break-free timeline in years, and your resulting projected gap. Breaking these down, the lifestyle income target is how much income does enough actually look like for you per year after tax when you stop work in today's dollar terms. Let's say you need 150 grand a year in today's dollars for you and your partner to enjoy your ideal lifestyle. To achieve this, your nest egg number, when you stop work, needs to be 3 million, made up of your super and all your investments, but excluding your family home, and that's based on a 5% net return. Next, what's your break-free time horizon, or how many years until you want to stop work or for work to be optional? Ideally, this needs to be 15 years plus for the magic of compounding to do its work. So let's say your break-free timeline is 15 years' time. From here, it's quite easy to project your gap between your projected nest egg number and your required nest egg number, which translates into your lifestyle income gap. So if your projected nest egg number is below your target, you need to focus on growth style properties and locations. But if your projected nest egg number is at or above your required target, your focus switches to cash flow style properties and locations. Now, most of you are likely to need to focus on growth unless you've already got a number of properties under your belt, and or you have a large and growing super balance or a big equities portfolio. And if this all sounds too confusing and complicated, feel free to reach out to me for a personal solution session by clicking the link in the show notes. And I'll help you to define your freedom numbers using our unique yet simple freedom numbers indicator, because from personal experience, I can share with you that knowing your freedom numbers are absolutely fundamental to achieving however you define your financial freedom, even if you don't appreciate that yet. And I can hear some of you saying, yeah, Bushy, I'll get to that later, because I'm more interested in buying a property. I just don't have time for this stuff. Well, you're exactly who I'm talking to. And mark my words, ignore your freedom numbers at your peril, because everything you need to do to achieve sustainable success starts right there. So if you're still building and your projected nest egg and your income gap is below where it needs to be and time's on your side, your primary job is growth accumulation. You're growing your nest egg asset base. You're building leverage and you're creating future options. But if your projected asset value is at or above your future nest egg number, or you're already work optional, then your focus is cash flow properties, and chasing more growth can actually increase risk. So that's when the game shifts from go for growth to convert to cash flow. Same property game, but very different job. So as you're listening, mentally choose your lane. Lane 1, I'm still building and going for growth. Or lane 2, I'm converting to cash flow. Because everything from here on will make more sense once you know which lane you're in. So if you don't yet know whether you need to be growth or cash flow focused, for the sake of today's argument, assume you need to focus on a growth property approach, because this leads into the most important concept that most investors miss, which I call the income for life curve. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So early in your investing journey, your job is to accumulate. You go for capital growth first that you can afford to hold, which is why I call it affordable growth. Why? Because growth creates equity, leverage, and options. And growth gives you choices later. So in phase 1 growth, you buy properties that future owner-occupiers will emotionally compete for, which usually means family-friendly homes in livable locations with proven demand and genuine scarcity. Not everywhere, only in the right ecosystem. Then, once enough growth is projected to do its job, you convert to cash flow properties and asset styles, which means you don't keep buying the same thing forever. You stop chasing the same scoreboard. Same game, but different rules. Now, phase 2 is about cash flow liberation. That's where you start turning growth equity into dual income. Income that pays the bills, funds your lifestyle, and lets you sleep at night. Because cash flow buys time, and time is your freedom. And here's the critical bit. The buy box that wins in growth is not the same property buy box that wins in cash flow. Different assets, different rules, which means growth homes versus income engines, and both matter, just at different times. So your job as an investor isn't to pick one forever. It's to progressively shift from affordable growth to cash flow income over time. That's why I always say, go for growth first, then convert to cash flow. That's not a slogan, that's a lifestyle. And this is where most investors get stuck. I buy 1 or 2 properties, never adjust the strategy, and then just hope it all works out. But hope is not a strategy. Once you know if your property focus is growth or cash flow, what you need next is a filter, a way to decide what to buy, where to buy, and what to avoid as the world keeps changing. Which is exactly what we're going to build next, because the next 10 to 15 years definitely won't look like the last 10 to 15. So we need to understand what pressure systems are coming, where they hit hardest, and how to read the weather before we buy. So let's zoom out and talk about the big forces changing the property scoreboard. Now, fair warning, this is the part of the episode where some of you are going to get uncomfortable. Not because it's complex, but because it messes with the idea that things will probably just keep working out. But history loves humbling that assumption, and the future will be no different. All right, now we're going to talk about why it all feels like everything is speeding up. Because if you want to understand the next 10 to 15 years, you need 2 things, a wind vane and a tide chart. Because what's coming isn't likely to just be a little wobble in the property landscape. It's likely, and it isn't likely to be a pothole. It's likely to be a lane closure with roadworks, detours, and a bloke in high vis waving in the wrong way. And it's pressure systems stacked on top of pressure systems. And most people won't notice until the roof comes off. Now, there are 2 futurist lands that I've been following that help you to see it clearly. Not perfectly, but early. Firstly, Peter Diamandis, the builder optimist. And secondly, Ray Kurzweil, the curve guy. Diamandis' basic worldview is when technology goes exponential, costs fall, capability rises, and big problems become solvable because incentives unleash armies of innovators. He's famous for his 6 Ds: digitize, deceive, disrupt, demonetize, dematerialize, and democratize. Translation? At first, it looks unimpressive. Then it quietly improves. Then one day, it smashes the incumbents, and suddenly, it's cheap and it's everywhere. That's why so many industries get caught out, because the early stage looks like a toy, and by the time it's real, it's too late to outrun it. And disruption never sends a calendar invite. It just turns up one day, eats your lunch, and leaves you holding a very expensive fax machine. Kurzweil's message is different. He says information technology doesn't grow in a straight line. It compounds exponentially. It looks like a hockey stick. So change feels slow until it doesn't. And then it feels like the future arrived while you are making a cup of tea. You walk back into the room and suddenly the kids are taller, rules have changed, and nobody remembers how it used to work. And here's the important bit. You don't have to agree with every prediction either of these guys makes to still learn from the pattern. They're useful because they train your brain to spot acceleration. But here's a word of caution. I'm not here to worship either of them because both of them tend to be underweight on the same three things: timing, distribution, and backlash, meaning things can stall, benefits aren't shared evenly, and politics pushes back. And property? Well, property is a political animal. So we use these futurist lenses as a filter, not a religion, not a belief system, not a personality, and definitely not a Twitter bio. So what's the filter for? It's to help us identify the big pressure systems that reshape where people earn, where they want to live, what homes cost to build, and which locations become must-have versus avoid like the plague. And over the next decade more, Australia still won't have one property market. It'll continue to have a patchwork of very variable property conditions. And inside that patchwork, it's likely to feel like a two-track property landscape. Now, I'm going to give you a practical promise. In a moment, I'm going to outline the pressure systems and the gauges that will help you read the weather. And then, to make it feel real, I'll give you some indicative examples of the kinds of microeconomy bowls that are likely to benefit and the kinds to treat carefully. Not as a hit list, no flashing arrows, no get in quick, no this will double by December, said with the normal super confidence, and no FOMO hotspots. Just real-world examples so you can recognise the pattern in the area that you're looking in without becoming part of the property Pied Piper parade. But before we zoom into Australia's property weather, we need to zoom out one more time because Diamandis and Kurzweil help us understand the speed of change. Now we need to understand the shape of the world that change lands in, which is where Zian and Dalio come in. So let's zoom right out again. Up to now, we've been talking about how fast the car is going. Now we need to talk about the road it's driving on, because speed without structure is how people end up in the paddock. So we've talked about the speed of change, AI, automation, exponential curves. That's the engine. But engines don't drive in a vacuum. They drive on roads. And if you want to understand property properly, you need to understand the shape of the world those changes land in. That's where these two next thinkers come in. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. I don't follow gurus. I don't outsource my thinking. I collect lenses like different coloured reading glasses. And the next two give us very different but very useful lenses. First up is Peter Zian. If you haven't heard of him, Zian's a geopolitical analyst. His obsession is structure. Things like geography, demographics, energy, food, and security. The slow, heavy stuff that doesn't change just because interest rates move or a government gets voted out. Think tectonic plates, not headlines. They don't move often, but when they do, everything on top of them has to adjust. Now, Zian's core belief is simple. Geography and demographics shape what countries can do, not what they want to do. In other words, you can't vote your way out of a shrinking workforce. You can't stimulus your way out of bad geography. Where I find Zian useful is that he doesn't start with, here's what should happen. He starts with, here's what has to happen given the constraints. And that's very helpful for investors. Zian's big ideas, in plain English, are the post-war world of cheap trade and global supply chains was unusual. It was propped up by American security, keeping shipping lanes open. And as populations age and politics turns inward, that system frays as we're seeing with the world leaders currently today. So the world becomes more regional, more defensive, more fragmented, and more expensive. Not overnight, but structurally. And here's the key point for Australia. Zian argues that countries that can feed themselves, power themselves, and defend themselves matter more in that kind of world, which is why Australia quietly moves up the strategic food chain, even if the ride gets bumpier. Now, Zian can be blunt, sometimes too blunt. It feels like he's delivering the weather forecast with a sledgehammer, which can be useful, but you still need to check the radar. And his timing isn't always perfect. So we don't take him as gospel, we take him as a map. Now, let's balance that with someone very different, Ray Dalio. Dalio is a hedge fund founder, one of the most successful macro investors of the last 50 years. And his obsession isn't geography, it's cycles. Dalio studies debt cycles, money printing, internal conflict, external conflict, and the rise and fall of empires. He looks at history like a repeating pattern, not a straight line of progress. Or put another way, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and it usually hums the tune right before it hits the chorus. Dalio's big message is this: the biggest risks aren't the ones everyone's currently arguing about. They're the ones that quietly build under the surface. Too much debt, too much leverage, too much inequality, until the system has to rebalance. And when the systems rebalance, governments intervene, rules change, taxes creep, rarely all at once, but rarely in your favour. And assets that can't move, like property, become very tempting targets because you can't offshore a house and it doesn't vote, which makes it very easy to lean on. When Dalio is useful for property investors, it's in that he reminds us that returns don't just come from growth. They come from surviving cycles, avoiding forced sales, and holding assets through regime changes. So again, we don't worship Dalio, we use him as a weather historian. So why do I use both lenses together? Well, Zian tells us where the world is constrained. Dalio tells us when systems get stressed. Zian explains why some places matter more, while Dalio explains why the rule book changes when pressure builds. Put them together and you stop asking where's the next hotspot, and you start asking which locations and assets are most likely to survive multiple futures. Because that's the moment you graduate from property tourism to property strategy. So what does all this mean for property? Not suburbs, not postcards, but patterns. It suggests over the next decade and a half, places tied to defence, logistics, energy, healthcare, education, and essential services will tend to have structural headwinds and tailwinds. I better get that right. They'll have structural tailwinds, which means that they will push them forward. Not guaranteed growth, but better resilience. And places that end up relying on one employer, one industry, cheap credit, endless new supply, or fragile insurance deserve extra caution. Not avoidance, just better buffers and sharper entry and exit discipline. And let me reinforce, this is not a hit list. I don't do hotspots. Hotspot lists create self-fulfilling hype and long-term disappointment. This is about recognising micro-economy bowls, the kinds of economic basins that fill with income, jobs and demand, or slowly drain. And shortly, I'll give you some indicative examples of those bowls. Not so you copy them, but so you can recognise the pattern where you end up looking. So now we've got the speed of change from Diamandis and Kurzweil, shape of the world from Zian and Dalio, which means we're finally ready to do the most important thing. Start reading the potential long-term property weather variations, the pressure systems to look out for, and the gauges to measure it, and how they affect locations and property types very differently. So let's zoom back in and build your variable property weather report. All right, we've completed the big setup. We've talked about the speed of change and the shape of the world. Now we zoom back in and turn all of that into something practical, because property investing isn't prophecy, it's pattern recognition. You don't need a crystal ball, you just need to stop ignoring the dark clouds because the open home had a nice kitchen. And the easiest way to think about property is like weather. You don't control the weather, you just learn to read it and dress appropriately. You don't wear thongs into a blizzard and then blame the weather when your toes fall off. And you don't buy a fragile property in a fragile economy and then act surprised when it bites. So here's my tool. I call it your property weather report, which has two parts: the 5 pressure systems and the 7 gauges. And once you learn them, you'll start hearing property conversations very differently. You'll spot the spruikers, and the sloppy thinking from a mile away. Now, the 5 pressure systems are what I call the 5 W's: work, what's, walls, wrinkles, and wild weather. So say it with me: work, what's, walls, wrinkles, and wild weather. If you remember nothing else, remember that, because every bad property story eventually traces back to one of those 5 being ignored. And if you can remember the 5 W's, you can anticipate Australia's property future without a crystal ball. Now, let's break them down, starting with work, because our work is unbundling. AI isn't just changing jobs, it's changing where work happens, how it happens, and who gets paid. That reshapes household income, borrowing power, and the demand map. So here's the simplest way to think about AI and jobs, in 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is automated, repeatable, rules-based work. If it's click, copy, paste, it's on the delete menu, and the chef doesn't take special requests. Bucket 2 is augmented, jobs where AI will make good people great with faster decisions, better output, and high leverage. Bucket 3 is anchored. Think hands-on, high-trust human work, like care roles, trades, safety-critical roles, and relationship work. Now here's the property translation. Locations heavy in bucket 1 are likely to see incomes get squeezed. Locations with strong bucket 2 and bucket 3 work are likely to hold demand better because the pay packets are likely to keep showing up. The second W is what's, energy and data. Think of what's like oxygen: no power, no productivity. And the grid upgrade: storage, transmission, plus data centres, all creating economic gravity. Some areas get pulled forward, others get left behind. The third pressure system is walls. Think housing supply, planning, infrastructure, and approvals. This is the handbrake on affordability. When supply can't respond, prices and rents don't behave like normal property conditions. Number 4 is wrinkles, which is our longevity. We're living longer. And this changes everything. More healthcare demand, more downsizing demand, more multi-generational living, more age-in-place renovations. So wrinkles are changing the housing mix. And the 5th and final pressure system is wild weather, which is climate and insurability. And I'll say this carefully: climate is no longer just a cause, it's a cost. Extreme weather events like floods and fires are increasingly becoming everyday. So when premiums explode or insurers exit, which they already are in many parts of the country, then buyers discount, banks get twitchy, and the whole local property environment can get a shadow over it. And this is only likely to get worse in the years ahead. So that's the 5 W's. Now, pressure systems tell you the big forces, but you still need instruments to understand them. And that's where the 7 gauges come in. Your gauges are robots, wallets, power, world, climate, people, and rulebook. Or the way I remember it: RW, PW, then CPR. RW, robots and wallets. PW, power and the world. Then CPR, climate, people, rulebook. So RW, PW, then CPR. Because if CPR stops, local demand dies and property prices flatline. Let's break this down. Firstly, robots. Ask, is AI and automation likely to hollow out local jobs or make them more valuable? Places built on repeatable admin and white-collar middle management are likely to get pressure. Places built on care, trades, defence, logistics and essential services are likely to hold up better. Secondly, wallets. Ask, are household wallets getting thicker or thinner? Not vibes, but real incomes. Because property runs on serviceability, and serviceability runs on wages. Gauge number 3 is power. Ask, does this place have energy advantage, grid investment, or power constraints? Because cheap, reliable power pulls industry, while unreliable power pushes it away. And power and data centres will become increasingly important in our growing AI world. W number 4 is world. Ask, how exposed is this area to global shocks like trade, tariffs, conflict, and China risk? Some local economies will likely get whiplash, while others will barely notice. Then comes the CPR gauges, starting with climate. Ask, what's the future insurance trajectory? What's the flood, fire, wind story? And is that risk priced in or ignored? Because you don't want to discover you bought a bargain that nobody will insure, or you need to take out a second mortgage to pay the insurance premium. Then there's people. Ask who's moving into the area and why. Is it jobs, lifestyle, education, family? Because population growth without strong incomes isn't a growth story, it's a strain story. And finally, there's the rulebook gauge. Ask, what are federal, state and local governments likely to do in terms of taxes, tenancy rules, planning rules and incentives? Because when pressure rises, the rulebook changes. Usually at 10 p.m. on the late news after a press conference, while a smiling minister and a very serious promise says, this won't affect most people. Just watch. Now, you've got that all. You've got the 5 Ws and the RW, PW, then CPR. And here's the line you should remember. If you can't explain the weather, don't buy the house. Now, to make this all real, I want to talk about microeconomy bowls. So think of Australia like a big landscape. Some places are bowls that naturally fill up with jobs, income, people and demand. Other bowls with a slow leak. And I'm going to be very clear here. I'm deliberately keeping this at the pattern level to help you recognise the bowl, not copy someone else's map. So this is not a buy here list because I don't do hotspots. Hotspot lists create hype, then disappointment, then podcast host or buyer's agent amnesia. So what I'm about to unpack is simply to make the patterns tangible so you can recognise the same dynamics when you're searching. So microeconomy bowls that are likely to benefit with tailwind type patterns include, firstly, defence and security ecosystems, and not just bases. The suppliers, the tradies, the engineers, the training, the logistics, which means steady demand because national security in a deglobalising world doesn't just get paused when rates go up. Secondly, logistics and industrial corridors like ports, intermodal hubs and warehousing, because in an increasingly more complex world, we'll hold more inventory, we'll move more goods locally, and land that can do that job will increasingly be scarce. Third, the microeconomy bowl is health and education anchors like hospitals and to a lesser degree campuses where the work is sticky, where people still show up even in downturns as our demographics change. Then there is energy and grid investment zones like renewables, storage and transmission. Not the announcement, but the actual build, where power increasingly becomes a magnet for industry and jobs. And finally, another potential growth bowl is likely to be diverse regional hubs as opposed to pretty towns. Think working hubs, multiple job engines, with government services, healthcare, education, logistics and trades. They're likely to hold up better because they don't rely on one story. At the opposite end of the scale, the following are bowls to treat carefully. Firstly, single employer and or single industry towns, because when one customer sneezes, the whole town gets the flu. If you buy in these areas, you need big buffers and very strong entry disciplines. Secondly, be wary of replicable new supply states where supply can be turned on like a tap. If there's always another stage and another release, then scarcity is a mirage. Thirdly, insurance stress pockets. Because if the premium curve is ugly, it's not just a cost. It becomes a buyer objection, a lender question, and a valuation risk. Number 4 to be careful of is long commute fringes, because if fuel, time and childcare costs rise, commute pain rises too, and some households rethink the trade-off. Not always, but more often. And finally, be wary of tourism-only economies. They're nice on weekends and on holidays, but if discretionary spending falls, occupancy and incomes wobble. Again, not never, but just don't pretend the area's recession-proof. So the message here isn't buy this town, it's buy the bowl that fills and be cautious of the bowls that leak. All right, before we talk about what to buy, we need to talk about what keeps you in the game, because most investors don't fail because they pick the wrong suburb. They fail because they can't afford to hold. So they fail quietly, then suddenly. Like running out of fuel 10 kilometres from the servo because he kept saying, I'll fill it up later. And here's the uncomfortable stat. The ATO has reported that around 54% of first-time investors sell their investment property within the first 5 years. Not at the peak, not triumphantly, not because property doesn't work, but because their cash flow doesn't. They get squeezed, they get spooked, they get forced, and they're usually exhausted over it and wondering what they missed. And forced selling is the opposite of the 15-year game. Compounding can't help you if you get bucked off the horse in year 4. So here's the principle. Income is oxygen, and property portfolios don't die dramatically, they suffocate. If you lose oxygen, everything else stops. The loan, your holding costs, your buffers, your lifestyle. So in this era of AI volatility and a rapidly changing world, you don't just build a portfolio. You build and protect your income engine. Now, most investors think affordability is, can I pay the mortgage? But that's kindergarten. True affordability is, can I carry this property through a messy season without panic selling? So true affordability includes loan repayments, rates and water, insurance and premium spikes, property management, maintenance and capex, land tax where relevant, body corporate if applicable, vacancy allowances, repairs allowances, and a life happens buffer, because life always happens. And in a world where job security is likely to change faster than a politician's promise during an election year, your affordability model has to be tougher than it used to be. So here's my blueprint. You don't need courage, you need buffers, because buffers can turn a crisis into an inconvenience. Or said another way, buffers stop bad years from becoming bad decisions. So here are your minimum buffer principles. Firstly, a cash buffer of 3 to 6 months of living costs and holding costs per property, or at least across the portfolio. Secondly, a war chest equity line buffer, which is an available equity line you can draw on only if and when needed for big repairs, vacancies, insurance spikes, land tax, or interest rate shocks or job changes, but costs you nothing if you don't use it. Thirdly, a home loan offset buffer where possible to keep liquidity accessible but not trapped. And lastly, a vacancy buffer where you assume every property will have downtime. So make sure you've got at least a month's worth of rent cover breathing space for a vacancy or tenant changeover. Because if you don't budget for all of this, property conditions will budget for you. And this will increasingly be the case as likely changes continue. And if you want to get fancy, you can then smooth your cash flow with legitimate tax planning methods like the PAYG withholding tax variations through your accountant. So you're not waiting for a tax return like a lifeboat. Now, let's talk work again, because your income's not guaranteed, and it's likely to be less so as the waves of change wash through. So you need to build a moat. In the approaching era, the safest income traits will be those that are hard to automate, hard to offshore, regulated or safety critical, relationship heavy, hands-on or high trust, and adaptable. So you don't just invest in property because the bank doesn't care how good your property is if your income taps stop working. So you need to invest in your skill stack, your network, and your optionality. Because the brutal truth is, a great property with weak income is a future for sale, while a good property with protected income is a future compounding machine. Now, with oxygen sorted, we can talk buy boxes with confidence, because if you can hold, you can win. Holding isn't glamorous, but it's undefeated. Now, remember your 2 lanes of affordable growth accumulation that wants scarcity and emotional owner-occupied demand in resilient income basins? And then there's cash flow conversion that wants deep rental pools tied to durable work with manageable maintenance and compliance. So each lane has different property product and different location type with the same weather report, because that's your overarching property selection framework. Next, we're going to take the weather report's pressure systems, gauges, and your property selection investment phase lens and apply them to what it means for your property buy box for each lane. What to chase, what to avoid, and how to stay in the game long enough for compounding to do its thing. Because wealth is a transfer of money from the impatient to the patient. So let's make sure you're on the right side of that transfer. Now, let's build your property buy box for growth accumulation. And then we'll stress test it against worst, best and likely futures, and then briefly touch on how that lens changes when you eventually convert to cash flow. So taking the weather report, we now turn it into a buy box you can actually use when you're tired, busy and making big decisions with real money. Again, this is your growth accumulation phase. So capital growth first, that's affordable to hold, because growth creates equity, leverage and options. Then later, you convert to cash flow. The same game, but different property scoreboard. Starting with the growth North Star. Now, this is the bit people overcomplicate. Growth isn't about cleverness. It's about buying the thing that most humans want and can afford for the longest time. That's it. So in growth accumulation, we're buying one thing above all: a home a future owner-occupier will fight over, the emotional buyer, because investors don't fall in love, but owner-occupiers do. And love makes people do irrational things, like stretch budgets, ignore spreadsheets, and say sentences like, "We'll make it work." And for the optimum capital growth, here's your default winner property profile. Not sexy, not Instagrammable, but relentlessly effective. The kind of property that wins quietly while louder strategies burn themselves out. And not every time, and not everywhere. But if the ecosystem is right, it's boring and it's brilliant. So I'm talking about 3 to 4 bedroom homes, 2 bathrooms, 2 living zones, 2-car garage, single level and low maintenance, with a block just big enough for kids and pets, but not so big you spend every weekend mowing like you're training for the Olympics. It also has a functional floor plan, good light, good storage, no weird stairs, no strange dead spaces, no who designed this moments, and ideally a genuine work from home nook that doesn't steal a bedroom. Because in an AI world, more of us are likely to work from home, even if they don't call it working from home anymore. They just call it working. So that's a sweet spot growth product that most Aussies will want to buy or rent, so is likely to have the highest demand. Now let's talk about location filters. And remember the hooks, the 5 W's of work, watts, walls, wrinkles and wild weather, and then RW, PW, then CPR, robots, wallets, power, world, climate, people, rulebook. Now, we're not using all 7 to make it complicated. We're using them as red flags to stop you stepping on rakes and smacking yourself in the face. So filter 1 is the income ecosystem. You'll need to buy inside a strong income basin, not one employer, not one industry, but multiple engines. Because the next buyer cohort doesn't arrive with cash. They arrive with wages, a lender, and borrowing capacity. So remember this: cash can move prices, but wages compound values. That's one of those lines worth writing down, because it explains most long-term winners and most long-term disappointments. Filter 2 is scarcity you can prove. You want scarcity that can't be measured. You want scarcity that can't be manufactured, like land constraints, walkable amenities, school zones, lifestyle desirability, and there's only so many of these streets. Not scarcity that's just marketing. If the developer can create it with a press release and a sales suite, it's not scarce, because if supply can be turned on like a tap, your growth ceiling gets lower. Now, filter 3 is lifestyle stickiness. Owner-occupiers pay up for lifestyle they can feel, like easy commute options, community vibe, parks, schools, services, and livability. That's what creates emotional bidding. Filter 4 is climate and insurance sanity. This isn't politics, it's arithmetic. If premiums rise hard or insurers pull back, that becomes a buyer objection, a lender question, a valuation risk. So we want resilience and insurability. Now let's turn to the growth red flag step on a rake list. Red flag 1, endless land release, hundreds of identical homes. It feels busy, but it's not scarce. It's a sausage factory. Red flag 2, investor-heavy precincts, because investors negotiate, owner-occupiers compete. Red flag 3, one-employer economies. Red flag 4, connectivity weakness. In a world where work unbundles, connectivity becomes fundamental. So low connectivity is the new bad road. Red flag 5 is the downsizer sugar hit trip. If prices in an area are driven mostly by cashed up downsizers, but there's no deep pool of working age incomes behind it, you can get a growth pop, then a long nap. Because again, cash can move prices, wages compound values. Next, we're going to stress test this growth buy box across best, likely, worst case future Australia. So you're positioned no matter which door Australia walks through. But before we do this, I want to give you a simple growth go or no-go gut check. This is the version you can use in real life, while you're driving, walking the dog, or standing in the kitchen scrolling listings like it's a hobby you never asked for. So no spreadsheets, no perfection, just 7 questions that keep you out of trouble. Because in growth accumulation, you're not buying property, you're buying future demand. All right, let's do it. The growth go, no-go. Question 1, can I comfortably hold this property if life gets messy? Not if life is perfect, if it gets messy. If rates move, a tenant leaves, a car dies, a kid needs braces, Tuesday. Because life rarely sends a calendar invite before it gets inconvenient. If holding this would stress you out, that's not growth, that's a stress subscription. Question 2, are jobs and incomes in this area getting stronger over time? Not vibes, not, mate said it's up and coming, but real work, real wages, and real depth. Because incomes are the tide and property values float on it. Question 3, is there deep owner-occupier love here? Would home buyers actually compete for this home, or just politely negotiate like it's a used fridge on Gumtree? Because owner-occupiers bid with emotion, and emotion is the only thing that consistently beats spreadsheets, because emotion creates premiums. Question 4, is scarcity real, or can they just build another 1,000 copies in different colours down the road? If supply is endless, your bargain can become a beige waiting room, and busy doesn't equal scarce. Busy just means more competition selling the same thing. Question 5, is this the kind of home buyers will still want in 10 or 15 years' time? Is it livable, practical, and future-loved? Because fashionable fades, but functional wins. Question 6, is the local economy resilient, with multiple employers, multiple growing industries, and multiple reasons people live there? Not a one-trick pony. Because when the music stops, one-trick towns fill up first. Question 7, are there any hidden deal breakers, like insurance nightmares, big repairs, planning gotchas, or connectivity weakness? The stuff that looks small today but becomes very expensive later. Now, if you're nodding along to most of those, you're probably in the right zone. If you're making excuses, your future self is already waving you from the dashboard saying, hey, don't. And for those of you who want to go deeper, I've built a full go, no-go checklist with detailed criteria and weightings, not to tell you what to buy, but to stop you buying things that look clever and behave badly later, so that you can objectively score property opportunities instead of guessing. And I'll let you know how and where you can get the checklist for free at the end of the episode. Let's now stress test this growth box against worst, best, and likely futures, because the goal isn't to be right in a boom, it's to survive the boring bits and thrive through cycles. All right, we've got the growth buy box, now we stress test it. Not because we enjoy worst case thinking, but because ignoring it is how people get surprised, and surprises are expensive. And property success isn't about being right for 12 months, it's about being consistent for 15 years plus. Long enough for scarcity, incomes, and compounding to do the heavy lifting, and long enough to avoid the number one portfolio killer, a forced sale. So we're going to run your buy box through 3 futures: worst case, best case, and likely case. Because the motto stays the same: plan for the worst, then manage for the best. And just quietly, this is where most investors fall over. They buy for a postcard version of the future, then life hands them the receipt. And every future gets tested through one truth. Property doesn't grow because you want it to, it grows because jobs grow, incomes grow, and more people can pay more for the same scarce asset. That's why your 3 I's of infrastructure, industry, and incomes matter. So follow the growing jobs and the growing incomes. That's the real engine behind value growth. So let's start with the scary one, worst case. Worst case is where multiple pressures hit at once, where AI hollows out the white-collar middle, where global instability rises, trades fractures, energy cost shocks pop up, inequality widens, and climate risk becomes an insurance and infrastructure crisis. Not a debate, but a bill. So what likely changes in work and income? Well, in worst case, routine white-collar work gets squeezed hard and hollowed out. Think admin, basic processing, middle management layers, and entry-level office ladders. And the big damage is this: the career ladder loses rungs. So it's harder for young people to start and harder for households to build income momentum. So job insecurity rises and borrowing power shrinks because banks hate uncertainty, which means households get cautious, spending slows, and in many places, wages stagnate, which means governments intervene more because when pressure rises, the rule book changes. So taxes creep, tax reform expands, and policies are sold as fair that feel very different when you're the one holding the asset. So what's the worst case property impact? Worst case doesn't mean property dies. It means fragility gets punished and resilience gets rewarded. Insurance becomes a divider. Some pockets become uninsurable-ish or bank unfriendly, which hits demand. And no demand means no compounding. So property values flatline or decline in those types of locations. So under worst case, the growth buy box survives only if you choose strong income basins, provable scarcity, and a product owner-occupiers still love, plus buffers, big buffers. Now let's flip it to the best case, where AI becomes a tool, not a trap, where productivity lifts, work gets redesigned, and yes, some roles vanish, but new roles appear faster. The ladder doesn't lose rungs, it gets new ones. In best case, what changes in work and income is we're likely to see growth in trades and technicians, energy and grid build, construction modernisation, healthcare and aged care, defence and sovereign capability, cyber, data and AI governance, logistics and supply chain redesign, and education and training. In best case, the middle class doesn't collapse, it retools. Wages rise in hands-on plus high-trust work. And incomes grow in the right basins. So the best case property impacts are likely to create a string of micro booms, not one national wave. So where jobs stack and incomes lift, family home assets compound quietly. And because supply is still slow, scarcity does its job to keep lifting property values. And lastly, the growth likely case is the messy middle, which is where most wealth is actually built. Not in booms, not in crashes, but in the long, boring, uneven middle, where AI is likely to boost productivity, but the benefits are uneven. Some people get a jetpack, while others get a redundancy email. So the economy becomes much more polarised, which is where inequality creeps in. What changes in work and income in the likely case is that routine white-collar roles shrink and get restructured. So many people reskill, but many don't. So job creation is uneven. Wage growth becomes patchy. And the biggest takeaway is income bases matter more than ever. So the likely case is where your 15-year thesis matters most, because the winners aren't the people who guess right, they're the people who can hold. They avoid forced sales, they ride the S-curve, and they hold a property long enough to let compounding do its value growth work. So what do we do with this? We don't pick the future. We pick the buy box that works across all futures. And your growth buy box wins when it sits at the intersection of growing jobs, growing incomes, and genuine scarcity. That's the simple version of your 3 I's of growth truth. Bringing this all together, here's the punchline. In growth accumulation, it's that you're not trying to buy the cheapest property. You're trying to buy the most future-loved property inside the strongest income ecosystem with provable scarcity and enough buffers to hold through the bumps. That's how you get above average growth without turning property into a second job. Now, let's step back and look at the second lane, cash flow, because this is where the game changes. Same assets, same country, but a very different job description. Stage 1's about growth. Stage 2 is about income. And the biggest mistake people make is trying to run a stage 1 playbook in a stage 2 season. So here's the high level truth. Stage 2 isn't about maximising yield. It's about maximising reliable net income with the least drama possible. Because freedom that feels like hard work isn't freedom, it's just a different uniform. At this stage, boring beats brilliant, predictable beats clever, and buffers stop bad years from becoming bad decisions. The big traps to avoid in this cash flow area are simple. Headline yield with no net reality. Fragile tenant pools. Strategies that rely on loopholes. An income that only works when everything goes perfectly. Stage 2 winners aren't flashy. They're durable, they're boring, and they keep you out of the inbox. Now, this part matters. Stage 2 cash flow property is a full episode all of its own, with a different buy box, a different stress test, and different mistakes. So today I'll deliberately keep this high level. If you want a dedicated deep dive episode on converting growth into reliable cash flow in a volatile future, just email me, message the show, or just let me know. And enough of you raise your hand, I'll build that episode properly. For now, understand this. Growth gets you options, cash flow funds your life. And timing the transition is just as important as choosing the right property. All right. Now, by starting with the end in mind and starting with the long-term future and working backwards, you can invest with a clear head and a clear lane, because the goal isn't just to buy a property, it's to build a portfolio that funds your life. So let's bring it all home now, because we've covered a hell of a lot of ground today. So if you're still with me, genuinely, well done. Most people want the result without investing the time of the thinking. And by listening to the end, you've done the thinking, which is what's going to separate the 5% who achieve sustainable success from the 95% who just want a quick result. Now, we've covered all the foreseeable big future forces, together with the real likely risks, and given you a way through a framework and approach that doesn't rely on luck or loud opinions. So let's land this plane in true Get Invested style, in a way that's fast, fun, and useful, starting with your fast forward bushfire lightning round. With no waffle and no wind up, just the truth, the corners sanded off so it doesn't cut you when you pick it up. Ambush number 1, what's the biggest risk for you as a property investor over the next 15 years? Well, it's buying a property where the income engine gets squeezed and then discovering, too late, that the old saying, if property always goes up, was actually property goes up in the right places with the right incomes when you can hold long enough. Because if you can't hold, you don't get the compounding, you just get the stress. Ambush question number 2, what's your biggest future opportunity? Well, it's the widening 2-track property landscape, which means owning scarce, owner-occupier love property inside strong income ecosystems, while everyone else is still chasing last year's headlines like seagulls chasing hot chips. So lots of noise, but not much nutrition. Because fussy beats FOMO and scarcity beats speculation. Ambush question number 3, what's your most overlooked factor? Well, no prize for guessing, it's insurance, which is climate and cover. Because the quiet truth is, a property can be beautiful and still become unbuyable if it's uninsurable or the holding costs explode, because pretty but fragile gets expensive and expensive gets unsellable faster than people expect. And finally, ambush question number 4, what's the one action that you could take today? Well, run your next decision through the 7 property weather gauges, not your gut, not your group chart, not the algorithm, but the gauges. Because if you can't understand or explain the future property weather, then don't buy the property. And here's some final food for thought. If sustainable property success for time-poor, hard-working Aussies is a 15-year plus long game, then the real question isn't where's the hotspot this year, it's where will income still be rising when the headlines have moved on? Because property doesn't grow because you bought it. It grows because over time, more people with stronger incomes can pay more for the same scarce asset. So zoom out, read and interpret the property weather of long-term currents. What works expanding? What skills are becoming scarce? What industries are getting tailwinds? And what parts of Australia will attract those people? And here's the bit most investors miss. If you don't protect your income, you don't get the compounding. So your job isn't just to buy the right property in the right area, it's to position your career, your business, and your skill stack so you ride the wave of opportunity, not crash in the trough of diminishing work. Because the best property strategy in the world fails on one thing: a forced sale. So make sure you can hold the asset and protect your income oxygen. Then and only then can you let time do the heavy lifting, because time is the cheat code, but only if you stay in the game. Now, a quick practical value add. If you want my detailed growth property opportunity go, no-go checklist, I'll send it to you for free, so you can actually use today's episode in the real world. No fluff, no upsell, just something you can use when you're about to make a big financial decision. I'll give you the Stage 1 Accumulate Capital Growth Lens for the owner-occupied love scarcity product. So to get it, just like and subscribe to the Property Hub and email me at bushy@khgroup.com.au. That's bushy@khgroup.com.au with the subject line, Go, No-Go Checklist. Because I always like to challenge you to take action in order to start achieving things. And that email subject line isn't for marketing. It's so my team can find it quickly without needing a treasure map. Now, if you're listening, thinking, okay, Bushy, I get the principles, but I'm not sure what this means for my exact situation or how to make this all work, or I just don't have the time, mate. Well, that's literally where I can help you. As your orchestra leader, I can help you bring it all together in concert with proven independent professionals into a plan that fits your freedom numbers, your risk profile, and your timeline. In plain English, I can help you do three things most people never get in one place. Firstly, your unique strategy. A long game life, finance, property strategy that links what you want to do lifestyle-wise with what you can do financially to define what you need to do in property. Secondly, your finance structure via our bare facts assessment that defines your borrowing strategy, buffers, property purchase power, and a unique affordability setup designed for your holding cost marathon. And thirdly, fiercely independent due diligence of locations and properties by a totally independent team of specialist proven professionals, so you get to enjoy the best of national coverage with intimate local expertise. Now, this is not me. This is me suggesting some professionals that have done the job and I've kept an eye on to make sure they're looking after you, not their own interests. And this is what I call your Secret Service agent, come watchdog, come guard dog property delivery, where I sit on your side of the table, protecting your interests and keeping everyone else absolutely honest. Because I don't sell anything. I just make sure you've got an experienced expert working for you that's vetting and validating everything that's being suggested to make sure you get the best outcomes aligned to your interests and not someone else's. And I help teach you the process so you can do it for yourself, and I work myself out of a job because I really don't want to keep doing this. To find out more or to get help with any issue you're having with property or finance, feel free to book in with me for a personal solution session by clicking the link in the episode show notes. And if it's not a fit, I'll tell you that too. So no pressure, just clarity. Now, to round out this week's special episode, here's your quote of the week. Stop chasing where property's been. Start reading where work and income are going, because the best hotspot isn't a suburb, it's a future. And what I mean by that is simple. If you can see the direction that jobs and incomes are moving, you can buy today in the places that will be loved tomorrow. And you can shape your own work to stay valuable, so you can fund your portfolio, hold through the bumps, and let long-term compounding turn patience into profit, then convert growth to cash flow, and finally fund your lifestyle so you don't have to work. And before we go, the usual quick common disclaimer. Everything that I've been discussing today is general information only, not financial, legal, or tax advice, because your situation is unique. So please confirm specifics with your licensed professionals before doing anything. With that said, I want you to have a great week. I look forward to sharing with you again. And remember that in whatever you're doing, don't drift, but always, always get invested.
Thanks for tuning in to Get Invested on the Property Hub podcast channel, your home for property investment insights and inspiration. Make sure you subscribe to Property Hub for free. Get your weekly dose of Get Invested inspiration along with every episode of Realty Talk, Australia's top online property show for red-hot property investing news and insights direct from industry leaders and influencers. And finally, I'll see you next time.